The rain had just stopped when I pulled my car onto the main street, the wipers dragging across the windshield with one last tired motion before I shut them off. The pavement glistened like black glass, each puddle catching fragments of neon signs and traffic lights, reflecting them back in fractured patterns. Nights like this always felt longer than they should, the hours stretching out beneath the heavy air left behind by the storm. I leaned back in my seat, adjusting the steering wheel with one hand, and reminded myself that I still had a few more hours to go before I could call it a night. The city was quiet, almost hushed, as though it too was catching its breath after being drenched. There is a rhythm to driving through the city at night, one I had memorized over years of repetition. The long stretches of empty road, the sudden bursts of headlights cutting across intersections, the occasional figure moving under a street lamp. My car had become an extension of myself, the steady hum beneath me as familiar as a heartbeat. Every night felt the same, and that sameness brought a strange kind of comfort. The routine dulled the loneliness, kept me moving, kept me from thinking too much. But that night, even as I tried to sink into the rhythm, I felt something different. It was subtle, nothing I could put into words, just a shift in the air. The dashboard lights glowed faintly against my skin, painting everything in shades of green and amber. The city was not truly asleep, only holding itself still, and I felt like I was waiting for something I could not name. There was no reason to expect anything unusual, but my chest carried a weight that had nothing to do with fatigue. The ride requests had slowed down after midnight, leaving me to wander the streets half empty, half expecting. Then the screen lit up with a new ping. Just an address, a name, a signal in the dark that someone needed me. I accepted it automatically, fingers moving without thought, but as I steered toward the location, a strange unease stirred inside me. Sometimes passengers carry stories in their silence, and even before I reached her, I sensed this one would leave something behind. The pickup spot was a side street, dim and narrow, slick with water that reflected the faint glow of a liquor store sign. I pulled over and watched as the back door opened slowly. She stepped in without a word, the sound of the door closing echoing louder than it should have in the quiet street. Her presence filled the car immediately, though she moved with an almost fragile slowness, as if her body carried a weight too heavy to bear. She sat back, pulling her coat around herself, and kept her gaze fixed downward. I had seen exhaustion before, seen drunkenness, even anger, but this was something else. The air seemed to shift the moment she settled in, growing heavier, charged with something unspoken. I caught a glimpse of her face in the rearview mirror, and the sight made my stomach clench. Her eyes were red, rimmed with tears, her lashes wet, her lips pressed tightly together, as if holding back a flood that had already begun to escape. She wasn't hiding it. The tears slid freely down her cheeks, and the glistening streaks caught the glow of passing streetlights. The sound of her breathing filled the car. Shaky, uneven, punctuated by soft, broken gasps she didn't bother to suppress. It was raw, unfiltered, the kind of sound that doesn't belong in the confined space of a stranger's car. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, unsure where to place the surge of feeling inside me. Something about her pain pressed itself against me, reaching past the invisible barrier that usually separates driver and passenger. I felt like an intruder into something deeply private, but at the same time, I couldn't look away. I turned the car back onto the main road, letting the city swallow us again. The silence between us was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It pulsed with her grief, with the unspoken story that hung over her like a storm cloud. Each red light cast us in a different glow, scarlet, then green, then a pale yellow flicker from some distant sign. The reflections painted her tears in colors, turning her sorrow into something I couldn't ignore. I realized then that this night would not pass like the others, no matter how much I wished it could. I had driven countless people, each with their own world folded tightly around them, but something about her felt different. Her silence wasn't a wall, it was an invitation into a darkness I wasn't sure I was ready to enter. The city blurred around us, wet streets rushing beneath the tires, while in the back seat she sat still, unraveling quietly, each tear a thread being pulled loose. I felt it in my bones that this ride was not just another entry in the long list of nights behind me. This was the beginning of something I would not be able to set aside when the meter stopped. The hum of the car, the faint smell of rain-soaked asphalt, the ghostly glow of the dashboard, all of it seemed to close in on me. My eyes flicked back to the mirror once more, and for the briefest second, her gaze met mine. Her eyes were glossy, almost luminous in their sorrow, and the look pierced straight through me. It wasn't a plea, not exactly. It was a confession, a raw exposure of pain without words, and it landed in the pit of my stomach like a weight I couldn't shake off. I looked away quickly, but the image burned itself into me, refusing to let go. That was how it began. A night like any other. A ride I thought would fade into memory, twisted into something else entirely. The rain-washed streets carried us forward, but inside that car, the air had already shifted. I knew, even without knowing why, that this woman, with her silent sobs and tear-streaked cheeks, would change the course of my night, and perhaps more than that. I drove on, my hands steady on the wheel, but inside, everything was already trembling. The city stretched out ahead of me, its streets slick with leftover rain, the lampposts dripping halos of light onto the asphalt. The hum of the engine was steady, a low vibration beneath my hands as I guided the car through the emptiness. Yet all of it seemed muted, distant, as though the world outside the car had faded, leaving only the fragile sound of her sorrow. Each uneven breath, each faint sob, carved into the silence, filling the air with a weight that pressed against my chest. I had carried strangers before, but none had made me feel the way she did in that moment. Her reflection lingered in the rearview mirror, soft and fractured by the glass, but powerful enough to unsettle me. Her face was tilted downward, strands of damp hair clinging to her cheek as her tears continued to fall unchecked. There was no effort to hide them, no pretense of composure, just the raw stream of grief slipping from her eyes. The sight pulled me in, as though each tear carried a secret, a story I wasn't meant to know, but could almost feel. The backseat of my car had become a confessional, though no words were spoken. Every red light seemed to last longer than it should, trapping us in stillness, locking me into the reality of her pain. The glow would wash over her face, painting her tears in crimson that slid down her skin like liquid fire. Then the green would replace it, a colder light that turned her sorrow almost spectral. I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter, as if the plastic beneath my hands could anchor me in the midst of the storm quietly unraveling behind me. I knew I should focus only on the road, but the weight of her presence pulled my attention back again and again. I tried to steady my breathing, matching it to the rhythm of the car, but it kept breaking when I heard the sound of her gasps. They were soft, but in the confined space, they felt enormous. Each one stretched across the silence, making it impossible to ignore. My chest ached in a way I couldn't explain, a strange ache born not from my own life, but from the undeniable intimacy of being so close to someone else's breaking point. It was as though her sorrow had seeped into the air, and I was inhaling it with every breath. The longer I drove, the more the city blurred into insignificance. Buildings became shapes, lights became streaks, and the wet pavement became a ribbon pulling us forward. Yet in the mirror, her image remained sharp, unignorable. She pressed her hands together tightly in her lap, fingers twitching, knuckles pale against the dark fabric of her clothes. The movement was small, almost imperceptible, but it revealed everything. She was trying to hold herself together and failing, piece by fragile piece. I felt the urge to reach back, to bridge the gap between front seat and back seat, to offer something more than the mechanical act of driving. But my hand remained on the wheel, my body restrained by years of unspoken rules. The line between driver and passenger had always been clear, a line I had never thought to cross. Yet in that moment, it felt thinner than paper, almost gone, dissolved by the sound of her sorrow and the sight of her unraveling. I realized I was no longer simply carrying her from one address to another. I was carrying her grief, even if she hadn't asked me to. The road stretched on, endless in its repetition of lights and shadows. I found myself listening more closely than I ever had before, counting the spaces between her sobs, the tremor in her breathing, the quiet moments where silence almost returned before being broken again. Each sound etched itself into me, marking me in ways I could not undo. I began to wonder what had brought her here, what weight she bore that no one else could see. The question burned, unspoken, as the night folded itself around us. The car smelled faintly of damp air and her perfume, subtle but present, mingling with the salt of her tears. It made the space feel intimate, almost unbearably so. I could sense the boundaries dissolving, not by touch or words, but by something more elusive. It was in the way her sorrow filled the silence so completely, leaving no room for pretense, no room for distance. I was not just a driver anymore. I was a witness, caught in the quiet collapse of a stranger's world. I drove on, the city sliding past like a forgotten dream, but inside the car, the moment stretched and deepened. She was breaking in the dark, and I was there, unable to turn away, unable to remain untouched. Every sob felt like it pressed against my skin, pulling me into her orbit. The tears in the dark were not mine, but they belonged to me now too, because I was the only one there to see them fall. And I knew, with a certainty that unsettled me, that this ride was already more than just a ride. It was a crossing, a shift, a step into something I could not yet name. The turn I took was not the one the map suggested. My hand moved on the wheel before I even thought about it, steering the car down a narrow street where the lights were weaker and the shadows longer. The silence inside the car was louder than the city outside, pressing against me from every direction. I felt her presence more than I saw it, the weight of her body leaning slightly forward, the warmth radiating from her even across the space between us. My pulse drummed hard in my ears, louder than the hum of the tires rolling over wet pavement. The windows began to fog as the minutes passed, each breath from the two of us leaving its mark on the glass. Drops of condensation slid down, breaking into crooked paths that caught the glow of passing lamps. I caught her reflection in the mirror again, but this time her eyes were lifted, searching, restless. There was no accusation in them, only something unspoken, something waiting. I felt my hands tighten on the wheel as though bracing for impact, though I wasn't sure what kind. I pulled the car over beneath a street light whose glow was faint and golden, barely cutting through the damp air. The world outside seemed to pause, no cars, no footsteps, only the faint hum of the engine between us. I sat there for a moment, my chest tight, before I finally turned halfway, glancing over my shoulder. She was sitting close to the edge of the seat, her coat slipping from one shoulder, her hair falling forward, as though she was unraveling in slow motion. Her knee brushed the back of my seat when she shifted, and the small contact sent a jolt through me. more electric than anything I had felt in months. I should have looked away, refocused on the road, but I couldn't. Her eyes locked with mine, steady and heavy, and I felt myself caught in the gravity of it. In that shared look, the line between what was allowed and what wasn't collapsed like paper in the rain. I didn't move toward her, but I didn't move away either. She leaned forward, and I felt her breath before I felt her touch. Warm, uneven, trembling against the curve of my neck. My skin prickled, every nerve alive, as if her breath alone had awakened something I had buried. I turned slowly, and suddenly her face was close, closer than it had ever been. Her lips parted slightly, her tears still damp on her cheeks. The closeness was unbearable and magnetic all at once, pulling me deeper into the moment without asking permission. Her hand found mine first, tentative, cool fingers brushing against my knuckles before sliding over my palm. The contact was so soft I almost doubted it had happened, but the shiver that ran through me proved otherwise. She held on, not tightly, but with a weight that spoke louder than any grasp. It was not desperation, it was recognition, the silent acknowledgement that something had shifted between us. I let my hand stay in hers, not resisting, not pulling away, surrendering to the inevitability of it. The fog on the windows thickened, turning the car into a cocoon, a sealed world where only the two of us existed. The streetlight outside cast a faint glow that traced the outline of her face, the curve of her lips, the slope of her shoulders. I felt the urge to memorize every detail, as though this moment would vanish as quickly as it had arrived. She slid closer, her thigh brushing against mine through the narrow gap of the front seats. The warmth of her body seeped into me, dissolving the last remnants of restraint I thought I had. When her lips touched mine, it was not sudden, but inevitable, like the final drop that tips a glass already overflowing. Soft at first, tentative, almost questioning, but filled with a force that came from somewhere deeper than impulse. Her mouth tasted faintly of salt, of rain, of the unspoken words that trembled in the air between us. My heart thudded against my ribs, my hands finding their way to her shoulders, her skin hot through the thin fabric of her blouse. The kiss deepened, and with it, the silence broke into fragments, replaced by the sound of our breathing. She pulled me further into the back seat, her movements clumsy but urgent, driven by something raw and unrestrained. I let myself follow, sinking into the space beside her, the leather squeaking beneath our shifting weight, her body pressed against mine, her chest rising and falling rapidly, and I felt every tremor pass from her into me. My hand slid along her sides, learning the shape of her, while hers found the small of my back, anchoring me to her, as though I might drift away otherwise. The car had become a vessel, carrying us nowhere, floating in a suspended moment outside of time. The condensation on the windows blurred the world into smears of light and shadow, erasing everything beyond our touch. Every brush of her lips, every press of her hands, every sigh slipping from her mouth sank deeper into me, weaving itself into the fabric of my body. I no longer thought of right or wrong, of beginnings or endings. There was only the heat of her against me, the inevitability of where we had found ourselves, and the quiet understanding that nothing would ever feel the same again. The back seat no longer felt like the confined space of a car. It had transformed into something else entirely, a fevered world contained by leather and fogged windows, where the rest of the city ceased to exist. My body moved with a hunger I didn't recognize as my own, a recklessness that came from the raw need she had unlocked in me. Her skin radiated warmth, each inch of her drawing me closer until I was no longer aware of where I ended and she began. The hum of the engine beneath us was the only reminder that reality still lingered outside, but even that felt distant, irrelevant. Her hair spread across the seat like a dark wave, strands catching against my fingers as I leaned down to trace the line of her neck with my mouth. The taste of her skin was electric, a mix of salt and heat that sent shivers racing down my spine. She arched beneath me, her breath breaking into sharp bursts that filled the air like sparks. My hand slid across her waist, fingertips pressing into the curve of her hip, claiming the shape of her body as though I had been waiting a lifetime to know it. Every movement pulled us deeper into a spiral of abandon. The fog on the glass thickened with each moment, sweat and breath turning the car into a private storm. I pushed her coat aside, her blouse falling open under my touch, the smoothness of her chest revealed in fragments as my mouth followed the trail my hands began. Her heartbeat was fast and erratic against my lips, each thud echoing the rhythm of my own. I felt the pulse of her desire in the way her thighs shifted, restless, aching, pressing against me as though she needed more than I could give. That urgency only fueled my own. I lowered myself further, kissing across her stomach, her skin trembling with every exhale. The sounds she made were small, but they carried more force than any word ever could, pulling me down into her completely. My hands held her thighs apart, my grip firm yet reverent, as if I were both controlling and surrendering in the same breath. Her body rose to meet me, hips lifting with instinct, demanding what she didn't need to ask for. I answered with my mouth, with my tongue, tasting her deeply, and the effect was immediate. She gasped, her fingers tangling in my hair, pressing me harder against her. The world outside could have collapsed, and I would not have noticed. The city lights blurred, the night air was forgotten, and there was only the rhythm of her hips against my face, the wet heat of her need, and the wild intoxication of giving in without restraint. She shuddered again and again, each wave pulling me under with her until I was drowning in her release. Her cries vibrated through me, raw and unrestrained, a symphony of pleasure that echoed in the small space of the car. I held her tightly through it, unwilling to let her escape the storm she had unleashed. When she finally fell back, her body trembling, her chest rising and falling in ragged breaths, I collapsed beside her, my own skin slick with sweat. The leather stuck to my arms, the smell of us thick in the air, sharp and undeniable. I stared at the roof of the car, the faint glow of the streetlight filtering through the misted glass, and I knew there was no way back. I had stepped past caution, past hesitation, into a place where desire ruled entirely. And the truth was, I did not regret it. Her hand slid across my stomach, shaky but purposeful, and I turned toward her again. Her eyes were heavy-lidded, dazed, but still burning with the same fire that had consumed us moments before. She pulled me into her arms, our bodies pressed together, slick and warm, the heat between us refusing to fade. My lips found hers again, slower this time, but no less desperate, sealing the recklessness of what we had done with one final kiss. The night held us suspended there, tangled and undone, and I knew I had given myself over to something I could no longer control. The first light crept through the fogged windows, slicing the darkness into pale streaks that cut across the leather seats and the tangled mess we had made of ourselves. My body felt heavy, the exhaustion of the night still clinging to me like a second skin, yet my mind was restless, refusing to surrender to any real calm. The air inside the car was thick, heavy with sweat, perfume and the sharp, unmistakable scent of what had happened between us. I breathed it in like smoke, knowing it would linger long after the morning pushed itself fully into the sky. There was no sense of triumph in me, only an unsettled awareness that I had crossed into something I could not undo. She stirred beside me, her head still resting against the seat, strands of hair stuck to her damp cheeks. Her chest rose and fell unevenly, the echo of her release still present in the rhythm of her body. I watched her with a quiet intensity, unable to look away, as if memorizing her face in that fragile state would anchor me to the truth of what we had done. She looked peaceful for a moment, yet I could see the weight of something deeper pressing down on her even in sleep. I wondered if her tears had been washed away by the night, or if they would return the moment her eyes opened. The outside world began to move again. Cars hummed distantly on nearby streets, the calls of birds broke through the stillness, and the city, relentless in its pace, demanded we step back into its rhythm. Yet inside the car, time felt stalled, like we had been caught in a pocket of hours separate from everyone else. The condensation on the windows began to fade as the sun grew stronger, revealing more of the world beyond, reminding me that we could not stay hidden here forever. The intrusion of daylight felt sharp, invasive, as though it was determined to strip the night of its secrecy. I shifted in my seat, the leather sticky against my bare arms, my skin humming with the echoes of her touch. Every movement reminded me of how far we had gone, how reckless and consuming it had been, how final in its inevitability. I wanted to freeze the moment, to hold it before it dissolved into regret or silence. But the morning would not wait for me. It pressed forward, insistent, dragging us toward choices neither of us had prepared to make. The weight of that realization pressed harder on me than the exhaustion ever could. She opened her eyes slowly, blinking against the invading light, her gaze hazy with the remnants of the night. For a second, she looked at me without fear, almost tenderly, as though what we shared had created something soft between us. But then the shift came, small but sharp, her expression folding in on itself, guarded and unreadable. I felt my stomach twist at the sight, a reminder that passion and reality rarely walk hand in hand for long. The night had been ours, but the morning belonged to the world again, and the world had no patience for the intimacy of strangers. She reached for her coat, pulling it around her with movements that were slower, heavier, yet purposeful. I stayed still, my hands pressed to my knees, watching her dress without saying anything. The silence between us was no longer charged with desire, but thick with something unresolved, something that stretched like a chasm I did not know how to cross. I wanted to touch her again, to remind her what had burned so brightly hours before, but the look in her eyes told me it would not be the same now. The morning had stolen that fire, replacing it with shadows I did not understand. When she finally stepped out of the car, the door clicking shut with finality, the cold air rushed in, carrying away the last traces of her warmth. She walked without looking back, her figure disappearing into the early light, as though the night had erased itself with her departure. I sat frozen behind the wheel, my hands still trembling, the smell of her skin and her sorrow still clinging to me. The street looked ordinary, the city was alive again, and yet nothing about me felt untouched. I knew I could drive away, but I also knew the road ahead would not erase what the night had carved into me. The morning did not wait, and neither could I. The engine roared back to life, the sound harsh after the fragile silence that had held us captive. As I pulled onto the street, I felt the world closing in again, the routine of work, the endless rhythm of the city reclaiming me. But beneath it all, there was a rawness that would not fade, a secret etched into my body, into my skin, into the back seat where everything had changed. The night had belonged to us, but the morning belonged to consequence, and it was already here. A week passed, though the days did not feel like days at all. They blurred into one another, an endless repetition of roads, fares, and hours spent inside the same car where the night had carved itself into my skin. Every time I drove past the street where I left her, my chest tightened, as though the city itself was mocking me with reminders of what I could not hold on to. I tried to bury it, to convince myself it had been nothing more than a reckless detour, but the silence in the car told me otherwise. The air seemed different now, tainted by memory, saturated with something I could neither forget nor confess. Then her address appeared again on my screen, the same block, the same numbers glowing faintly against the map, pulling me back to the place where everything began. My hands trembled on the wheel, the faintest surge of anticipation coursing through me, despite every warning my body tried to give. I thought it might be her, that she had chosen me again, that the night had not ended after all, but lingered, waiting to resume. I drove there faster than I meant to, heart pounding with the weight of imagined possibilities. But when the door opened, it wasn't her. Another woman stepped inside, calm and composed, her movements sharp in contrast to the fragility I remembered. She smelled faintly of expensive perfume, her hair carefully styled, her lips painted with precision. She sat down with deliberate grace, folding her hands on her lap as though she owned the space instantly. I looked at her in the mirror, searching for an explanation, but her gaze did not waver, cold and steady, pinning me in place. Without a word, she reached into her bag and produced a plain envelope. She leaned forward slightly and placed it on the passenger seat beside me, her expression unreadable. The paper was unmarked, yet it seemed to radiate a kind of menace, as if it carried more weight than its thin frame should allow. My fingers hovered above it, hesitant, but I knew I would open it before long. The car felt smaller, darker, though the sun outside was bright and clear. I pulled over, unable to keep driving without knowing. My hands tore the flap with a kind of desperation, as though the answer inside might give me relief. What I saw instead made my breath catch in my throat. A photograph stared back at me, one that should never have existed, one that should have been impossible. It was us, her and me, caught in the back seat, bodies pressed together, lips locked, clothes disheveled, the windows dripping with condensation. The intimacy we thought had been swallowed by the night had been captured, frozen, stolen. I stared at the image, my stomach twisting violently, my skin crawling with shock. Every detail was there, my hand sliding across her thigh, her head tilted back, the desperation etched into both of us. It was not a suggestion or a hint. It was proof, undeniable and merciless. Someone had seen us. Someone had recorded what was never meant for another set of eyes. The privacy of that night, the illusion of secrecy, was shattered in an instant. Beneath the photo, scrawled in ink that seemed almost mocking in its simplicity, were two words: she talked. My blood ran cold, the words stabbing deeper than the image itself. I thought of her tears, her trembling body, her silence afterward, and I realized I had no idea what had followed when she walked away. Whether she had confessed, or been coerced, or betrayed me outright, the truth no longer mattered. The evidence was here, in my lap, undeniable and raw. The woman in the back seat remained still, her presence looming, her eyes fixed on me in the mirror. She did not smile, but she didn't need to. The envelope was the smile, the weapon, the chain that bound me now. I gripped the wheel, though I wasn't driving, my palms slick with sweat, my breathing shallow and uneven. The silence between us was suffocating, filled with the weight of knowledge I had never asked for. I felt violated, exposed, yet some darker part of me stirred with something else, an uneasy mixture of shame and thrill. To be seen, to be revealed, to be caught in the most intimate and reckless act of my life. There was horror in it, but there was also a twisted kind of provocation. I hated myself for feeling it, hated the pulse that quickened in my chest as though some buried desire had been uncovered along with the photo. The image burned into my mind, and I knew it would haunt me more deeply than the night itself ever could. The woman finally spoke with her silence, a command without words, her stillness more powerful than speech. I started the car again, the engine roaring too loudly, and pulled back onto the road without knowing where I was taking her. The envelope lay open beside me, the photograph staring up like an accusation, or perhaps a promise. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, but I didn't throw the photo away. I couldn't. The provocation had already taken root inside me. As the city unfolded before us, I understood that nothing was finished. The night had not been an ending, nor even a beginning. It had been a trigger, a spark that had set fire to something much larger. I was no longer simply a driver, and she was no longer just a passenger. I was caught in a web I couldn't see fully yet, a game played by rules I had never agreed to. The photograph was proof that my life no longer belonged only to me. The woman sat silently in the back seat, and I drove on, the picture still burning in my mind. My body trembled with a sickening mixture of dread and arousal, shame and longing, fear and hunger. I had become both the victim and the participant in something I couldn't name. And as the streets passed by in a blur, I realized with a shiver that I didn't want to escape it, not yet. The provocation had already claimed me, and I was no longer certain I wanted to be free.